The gymnasium fell silent as the United States Naval Academy's class of 2024 rose in unison, their dress whites gleaming under the arena lights. Families crowded the bleachers, cameras raised, capturing sons and daughters on the precipice of naval service. Near the back entrance, pressed against the cold concrete wall where shadows gathered thick, stood a figure the ushers had tried twice to remove. His jacket was military surplus faded woodland camouflage with no insignia, hanging loose over a frame that had once carried more weight. His jeans were clean but worn through at the knees. His boots were civilian, not the polished leather of ceremony. His face carried the weather of too many nights outside, but his eyes remained sharp, tracking movement across the graduating class with the focus of someone who'd learned to see what others missed. Security had questioned him. He'd shown no ticket, offered no explanation, just stood there, motionless, watching the rows of midshipmen with an intensity that made the guards uncomfortable. They'd been about to escort him out when the ceremony began, and protocol demanded they wait. Now he stood like a ghost at the edge of celebration, invisible to everyone except the son who didn't know he'd come. Rear Admiral Patricia Voss moved through the crowd with the economy of someone who'd spent 30 years turning movement into mission. She'd flown A-10 Thunderbolts over Helmand Province when the war was brutal and close, before the politicians started calling it a conflict. She'd put ordnance danger close when Marines were dying and every second counted. Now she wore stars on her shoulders and gave speeches about heritage and honor, but her eyes still moved like a pilot's, scanning sectors, noting details others missed. She saw him immediately, not because he stood out but because he didn't try to. The way he positioned himself in the blind spot of the security camera. The way his weight stayed balanced on both feet, ready to move. The way his hands remained visible and empty, showing no threat. These were habits that didn't come from homelessness. They came from training that went bone deep. She changed course, moving along the wall's perimeter. He didn't notice her approach. His attention remained fixed on a midshipman in the third row, fifth from the left. Ensign James Corrigan, 22 years old, top marks in tactical systems, commissioned into naval aviation. When the Admiral reached him close enough to see the frayed collar of his jacket, she noticed his right forearm. The sleeve had ridden up slightly. Beneath it, faded but unmistakable, was ink. Not random prison work, not civilian art, military ink, specific unit ink. She'd seen that exact symbol only twice before in her career, both times on the forearms of men who weren't supposed to exist in any official record. The Admiral stopped walking. Her hand moved instinctively toward the tattoo, then froze 6 inches away. The man finally noticed her. His body didn't tense, didn't shift. He simply turned his head and met her eyes with the calm of someone who'd been caught before and knew exactly what came next. For 3 seconds, neither spoke. The graduating class sang the Navy hymn, their voices rising toward the rafters while shadows deepened along the walls. Then Admiral Voss did something that surprised them both. She stepped closer, positioning herself beside him instead of in front, and asked the only question that mattered. "Which one is yours?" The man's throat worked. His voice came rough like it hadn't been used for conversation in months. "Third row, fifth from the left. He doesn't know I'm here." "Why not?" "Because I promised his mother I'd stay away." The words carried no self-pity, just fact. She remarried, good man, gave him stability, gave him this. He gestured toward the ceremony, toward the future unfolding in dress whites and gold ensign bars. "I gave him nothing but bad dreams and a last name he doesn't use anymore." Admiral Voss studied the midshipman, James Corrigan. The file she'd reviewed showed him as exemplary, natural pilot, strong tactical mind, single mother who'd remarried when the boy was 8, father listed as deceased, killed in action, no details, no unit, no grave. She looked at the tattoo again, at the man wearing surplus camouflage to his son's graduation, because it was probably the only jacket he owned. At the way he stood watching the ceremony like a man bearing witness to something holy and unreachable. "What's your name?" doesn't matter anymore. It matters to me. The Admiral's voice carried command, but something else underneath, something that sounded like understanding. And it's about to matter to your son, whether you want it to or not. The man finally turned to face her fully. Up close, she could see more. The scar tissue along his jaw, the way his left hand didn't quite close all the way, the deep lines around his eyes from squinting at hostile skis. He was older than she'd first thought, mid-50s maybe, but he moved younger, still carried the coiled awareness of someone who'd survived by staying ready. Captain Marcus Corrigan, he said quietly, retired, honorably, before everything went wrong. The name hit her like ordnance. She knew it, not personally but from legend, from the stories that got told in ready rooms when the official history wasn't enough. Marcus Corrigan, call sign Revenant. He'd flown combat search and rescue during the darkest years of the war. The missions nobody talked about because they'd never officially happened. He'd gone into places where the maps just showed empty desert and brought people out who weren't supposed to be there. He'd flown helicopters with no markings into hostile territory and pulled operators from situations that would have been classified for 50 years. Then he disappeared from service. No fanfare, no retirement ceremony, just gone from the rolls, replaced by a death certificate that satisfied the paperwork but convinced nobody who'd actually known him. "You flew SAR," Admiral Voss said, not a question. "I flew where they told me to fly. Behind enemy lines, off the record, pulling out operators who officially didn't exist." Marcus looked at her with eyes that had seen too much darkness, something like that. "And you came back wrong." He smiled, but there was no humor in it. "I came back exactly right for what I'd been doing, just too wrong for civilian life, for family life, for a son who needed a father instead of a ghost." His attention drifted back to James, standing with his classmates, singing words about those in peril on the sea. His mother tried, God knows she tried, but I'd wake up at 3 in the morning with my hands around her throat, thinking I was still in Kandahar, still being interrogated. I'd hear helicopters and hit the floor. I'd see crowds and start planning extraction routes. Therapist called it PTSD. I called it being honest about what I'd become. "So you left." "So I left before I hurt them worse than my absence would." Marcus's voice remained steady, but his hands betrayed him, fingers curling and uncurling at his sides. "Signed the papers. Took the honorable discharge they offered instead of the medical one I probably deserved. Let his mother tell him I was dead so he could grow up clean, without my damage bleeding into his childhood." Admiral Voss watched James Corrigan stand at attention, watched him receive his commission, watched him become an officer in the service his father had broken himself for. She thought about the cost of that, about men who flew into hell and came back changed, about families that fractured under the weight of classified missions and unspoken trauma, about sons who grew up not knowing their fathers were heroes because the heroes themselves believed they'd become monsters. "He's going to be a pilot," she said. "I know." Marcus's voice carried pride and terror in equal measure. "Requested naval aviation, top of his class in flight qualifications. He's going to fly helicopters." A muscle worked in his jaw, just like his old man. The ceremony continued around them. Officers gave speeches about duty and honor. Families applauded. Cameras flashed. But in the shadows against the back wall, a rear admiral and a homeless veteran stood together, watching a young man step into the same sky that had broken his father. "You can't let him fly without knowing," Admiral Voss said finally. "Not helicopters, not combat search and rescue, not into the same darkness that took you apart. He doesn't know I exist." "Then make him know." The Admiral's voice carried command now, the kind that didn't allow for argument. "Because if he goes up without understanding what it costs, without learning from someone who paid the price, he'll come back the same way you did, broken and convinced he has to break alone." Marcus looked at her with eyes that had stopped hopping for redemption years ago. "Why do you care?" Because I flew A-10s when the war was new, put ordnance close when Marines were dying, came back with my own ghosts. Admiral Voss met his gaze without flinching. And because 30 years ago a pilot named Revenant pulled my wingman out of a crash site in Helmand Province when everyone else said it was too hot, too exposed, too late, I never got to thank him. The mission stayed classified. The rescue never officially happened. But I know what it cost. I know what it takes to fly into hell for someone else. And I know what it means when men like that disappear. The gymnasium lights seemed brighter suddenly, reflecting off dress whites and polished floors. Marcus Corrigan stood very still, processing information that rewrote his understanding of this moment. "Your wingman," he said slowly. "Captain First Class, Sarah Chen, Charlie 37, October 19th. We pulled her from a crashed Warthog 3 kilometers inside enemy territory. She had a broken back and a compound fracture in her left leg. Kept asking about her aircraft. Kept saying she couldn't leave her aircraft behind." Admiral Voss felt tears she hadn't known were coming. "You carried her 600 meters to the extraction point while taking sniper fire. You flew through a sandstorm with zero visibility. And you told her that aircraft were replaceable but wingmen weren't. She lived. She lived, flew again, made Admiral before I did." Voss's voice steadied. "And she never forgot the pilot who refused to leave her behind. Neither did I." The ceremony was ending. Midshipmen threw their covers in the air. Families rushed forward. The orderly rows dissolved into celebration. James Corrigan moved with his classmates toward the exit, toward the reception, toward a future that suddenly seemed less certain than it had 5 minutes ago. Admiral Voss made a decision that would either heal or shatter what remained of this family. She stepped forward, moving into James Corrigan's path with the authority of her rank. The young ensign stopped immediately, coming to attention. "Ensign Corrigan," the Admiral said clearly, her voice carrying over the crowd. "There's someone here who needs to speak with you." James looked confused. His eyes moved past the Admiral toward the back wall, toward the shadows where his father stood frozen, caught between the instinct to run and the hope he'd thought was dead. "Ma'am, I don't understand." "You will." Admiral Voss gestured toward Marcus. "That man saved my life 20 years ago. He flew into enemy territory when nobody else would. He brought me home when I should have died. And he has something to tell you about the cost of being the kind of pilot who refuses to leave people behind." James followed her gesture, saw the homeless veteran in surplus camouflage, saw the weathered face and the careful distance, saw something in the posture that looked almost familiar, like a photograph he'd seen once and never quite forgotten. Marcus took one step forward, then another. His boots made no sound on the gymnasium floor. The crowd moved around them like water around stone. When he stood directly in front of his son, close enough to see the boy he'd left behind in the man's features, he finally found words. "Your mother told you I was dead. She was being kind. The truth is I died in pieces over 10 years, and by the time there was nothing left worth saving, you deserved better than watching the rest disappear." James stared at him. Recognition came slowly, fighting against years of carefully constructed narrative. "You're supposed to be dead. You died when I was 8. Helicopter crash. No remains recovered." "I crashed," Marcus agreed. "Just not the way your mother explained, and there were remains. They're just still walking around trying to figure out how to be human again." He lifted his right arm, showing the tattoo. "I was Captain Marcus Corrigan, call sign Revenant. I flew combat search and rescue for 12 years, classified missions, off-book operations. I pulled people out of situations that officially never happened, and it broke something in me that never healed right." The gymnasium had gone quiet around them. Other families watched, sensing something significant happening but not understanding what. Admiral Voss stood guard, keeping security at a distance, giving father and son the space that years had denied them. James's hand moved to his cover, gripping it like an anchor. "Why now? Why tell me now?" "Because you're going to fly helicopters, combat search and rescue, and if you go up without knowing what it costs, you'll learn the hard way. You'll come back broken like I did, and you'll think you have to carry it alone like I did, and I can't let that happen." Marcus's voice finally cracked. "I can't watch you become what I became, not when I know how to warn you. Not when I can tell you that the ghosts are real, and the darkness is waiting, and you need people around you who understand when you come back changed." Tears ran down James's face, anger and grief and relief mixing together in expressions that couldn't hold still. "You left us. You let me think you were dead. You let me grow up without a father. I know, and I'm sorry, and I'd do it again because you deserved better than what I'd become." Marcus didn't reach for his son, didn't try to close the distance. "But you also deserve to know the truth before you follow me into that sky. You deserve to know that some missions cost more than they tell you in training, that some rescues take pieces of you that don't grow back, that the best pilots sometimes become the most broken people, and you need to decide now, before you commit, whether you're willing to pay that price." James looked at Admiral Voss. "Is this real? Is he really who he says?" "Captain Marcus Corrigan, call sign Revenant," the Admiral confirmed. "One of the finest search and rescue pilots who ever flew. He pulled my wingman from a crash site when everyone else said it was impossible. He's the reason she's alive today. He's the reason I'm standing here. And he's the reason you need to understand what you're committing to when you choose combat aviation." The young ensign stood at a crossroads. Behind him was the ceremony, the celebration, the clean narrative of service and honor. Before him was a father who'd been dead for 14 years, resurrected by tattoos and truth. Around him, his new brothers and sisters in uniform watched, waiting to see what he'd choose. James Corrigan made his decision. He stepped forward, closing the distance his father wouldn't cross, and said the words that would change everything. "Then teach me. Teach me how to fly like you did. Teach me how to come back whole. Teach me how to be the kind of pilot who saves people without losing himself." Marcus Corrigan, homeless veteran and forgotten hero, stood in the Naval Academy gymnasium and felt something he hadn't felt in 14 years. Hope. It was fragile and new and terrifying, but it was real. And for the first time since he'd walked away from his family, he believed he might have something worth offering after all. Admiral Voss watched father and son stand together in the aftermath of revelation. She thought about wingmen who didn't leave each other behind, about pilots who flew into darkness for people they'd never met, about the cost of service that got paid in pieces over decades, about families that fractured and somehow, impossibly, found ways to heal. The ceremony was over. The celebration continued around them, but something else had begun. Something that would take a broken pilot, a new ensign, and an admiral who remembered being saved, and turn them into a story about what it meant to truly come home from war. James's mother found them 10 minutes later. She pushed through the crowd with the urgency of someone who'd seen her carefully constructed world beginning to crack. When she saw Marcus standing with their son, she froze. Her new husband stood beside her, confused but protective. James turned to face her, his expression complex with emotions she couldn't quite read. "Mom," he said quietly, "we need to talk." She looked at Marcus with eyes that held 14 years of difficult choices. You promised you'd stay away." "I kept that promise," Marcus replied. His voice was gentle, without accusation. "I stayed away while he grew up. I stayed away while you built a good life for him. I stayed away until today, when staying away would have meant watching him walk into the same sky that destroyed me, with no warning, no preparation, no understanding of what's waiting up there. He doesn't need you." The words came sharp, defensive, a mother protecting her child from pain. "He has a father, a good man who raised him, who was there for every birthday and every graduation, who taught him how to be strong without teaching him how to break." The man beside her, James's stepfather, put a hand on her shoulder. "Sarah, maybe we should hear what he has to say. You don't understand. You didn't see what he became, The nightmares, the violence, the way he'd look at us like he didn't recognize his own family. She turned to James, pleading, "You were 8 years old. You don't remember how bad it got." "I remember enough," James said. His voice was calm, measured, officer training showing through. "I remember nightmares that woke the whole house. I remember you crying in the kitchen at 3 in the morning. I remember the last time I saw him, how he looked at me like he was afraid of what he might do. He looked at Marcus. I remember being scared of my own father." Marcus absorbed the words like ordnance, each one landing precisely where it hurt most. "You should have been scared. I was scared of myself. That's why I left." "But that's not who you are now," Admiral Voss interjected. Her voice carried authority that cut through the emotion. "I've spent the last 15 minutes watching this man, reading his body language, seeing how he moves. He's not the same person who left 14 years ago. The ghosts are still there, but he's learned to live with them. He's learned to be human again, even if that humanity looks different than it used to." Sarah Corrigan, James's mother, looked at the Admiral with recognition. "You're Patricia Voss. You flew A-10s. You commanded the air wing before you made flag rank." "I'm also the wingman your husband pulled from a crash site in Helmand Province. The pilot he risked his life to save when protocol said to leave me behind." Admiral Voss met Sarah's eyes with the weight of someone who understood exactly what this family had sacrificed. "I owe my life to Marcus Corrigan, and I owe him the truth about what that rescue cost him, about what all those rescues cost him, about why he came back broken and why he left before he broke you too." The gymnasium was emptying now. Families filtered toward the exits, toward receptions and celebrations. But this group remained, circled together in the space where commission met revelation. James stood at the center, looking between his mother, his stepfather, his birth father, and the Admiral who was rewriting the narrative he'd lived with for 14 years. "I'm going to fly helicopters," James said into the silence. "Combat search and rescue. I've already requested the pipeline. I've already committed." He looked at Marcus. "Admiral Voss is right. If I'm going to do this, I need to understand what I'm walking into. I need to learn from someone who's been there, even if that someone is a father I thought was dead." Sarah closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were wet but determined. "You'll stay in contact this time. No more disappearing. No more making decisions about what we can or can't handle." "I'm homeless," Marcus said bluntly. "I sleep in shelters. I've got $70 in my pocket and no permanent address. I'm not exactly Father of the Year material." "Then we fix that," James said. The certainty in his voice was new, officer confident, the voice of someone who'd learned to give orders. "You're going to stay with me. I've got housing allowance coming. We're going to figure this out together." "Your mother—" "My mother raised me to take care of people who need help." James looked at Sarah, who was crying openly now. "She taught me that family doesn't abandon each other, even when things get hard. She taught me that the right thing to do is usually the difficult thing. And the right thing now is bringing you back, teaching you how to live again, and learning from you how to fly into darkness without losing myself." Marcus Corrigan, who had survived 12 years of classified combat missions, who had flown through hell and brought people home, who had broken himself apart to save operators who officially didn't exist, finally cracked. Tears came silently, running down weathered cheeks. His shoulders shook. His hands, which had held helicopter controls steady through sandstorms and enemy fire, trembled with the weight of grace he'd never expected to receive. Admiral Voss stepped back, giving the family space. She'd done what she came to do. She'd returned a debt that was 14 years overdue. She'd made sure that the next generation of pilots would learn from someone who understood the real cost of the mission. Around her, the gymnasium emptied completely. Security watched from a distance, uncertain but respectful. The ceremony was over, but something more important had begun. James's stepfather, who had been silent through most of the exchange, finally spoke. His voice was kind, measured, the voice of a man who'd raised another man's son and done it well. "I'm David. I've been James's father since he was 8 years old. I've loved him like my own. I've been proud of every achievement and every choice." He looked at Marcus directly. "But I've also known this day would come. A man like you doesn't just disappear. And a son like James deserves to know where he came from before he steps into the same sky." He extended his hand. "Welcome back, Marcus. We've got a lot to figure out, but we'll figure it out together." Marcus stared at the offered hand like it was ordnance, something dangerous and unpredictable. Then slowly, carefully, he reached out and took it. The handshake was firm, brief, weighted with significance neither man could fully articulate. Sarah stepped forward. She didn't offer a handshake, didn't offer forgiveness or absolution, but she offered something more important. "You're going to be clean, you're going to be sober, you're going to show up. And if you disappear again, if you walk away again, you don't get another chance. Understood?" "Understood." Marcus's voice was steady now, anchored by accountability he'd been missing for years. "Then let's go. James has a reception to attend. His family should be there, all of his family." She turned to Admiral Voss. "Will you join us? James should know the whole story, about who his father was, about what he did, about why the best pilots sometimes come back broken." Admiral Voss nodded. "I'll tell him everything I'm authorized to tell, and some things I probably shouldn't but will anyway, because he deserves to know the truth." They moved together through the emptying gymnasium, an unlikely group bound by service and sacrifice and the complicated truth of what it meant to fly into danger for people who'd never know your name. Marcus walked between his son and his admiral, feeling the weight of 14 years beginning to lift. It wouldn't be easy. The ghosts wouldn't disappear. The nightmares wouldn't stop. But for the first time since he'd left, he believed there might be a path back to being human, not the human he'd been before. But something new, something forged from broken pieces and hard truth. The reception hall was crowded with graduates and families. James introduced Marcus carefully, explaining only that his father was alive, had been away, and was back now. People asked questions. Marcus deflected with the skill of someone who'd spent years keeping secrets. Admiral Voss stayed close, providing legitimacy through her presence. Sarah and David watched from the edges, protective but allowing space. As the evening progressed, James pulled Marcus aside. They stood on the balcony overlooking the Severn River, watching boats move through water that caught the last light of day. The young ensign still wore his dress whites. The homeless veteran still wore surplus camouflage. Between them was everything that had been lost and everything that might still be recovered. "Tell me about the missions," James said quietly. "The classified ones, the rescues that never officially happened. Tell me what it was really like." Marcus looked out at the water. Memories moved beneath the surface, dark shapes that never quite breached into daylight. It was beautiful and terrible, flying at night with no lights, using terrain to hide from radar, going into places where the maps ended and the rules stopped applying, finding people who'd given up hope and bringing them home anyway. His hands gripped the railing. But it was also watching friends die when the missions went wrong. It was living with the knowledge that one mistake, 1 second of bad judgment, meant people didn't come home. It was carrying the weight of every face you saved and every face you couldn't reach in time. "How did you live with that?" "I didn't. Not well. I tried to drink it away, tried to push it down, tried to pretend I was fine, but the ghosts kept coming back. The memories kept replaying. And eventually I realized I had two choices, hurt the people I loved by staying or hurt them less by leaving." Marcus turned to face his son. "I chose wrong. I see that now. I should have stayed and fought through it. Should have trusted your mother to handle the truth. Should have believed that broken didn't mean unfixable. But at the time, leaving felt like the only way to keep you safe." James was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried understanding beyond his years. "You're going to teach me how to not make that same choice. You're going to teach me how to carry the ghosts without letting them destroy my family. You're going to show me how to be the kind of pilot who saves people without losing himself. I don't know if I can do that. I don't know if I've figured that out myself." "Then we'll figure it out together." James's hand found Marcus's shoulder, the touch careful but deliberate. That's what wingmen do, right? They don't leave each other behind. Marcus felt something fundamental shift. The weight didn't disappear, but it redistributed, became bearable, became shared. He looked at his son, at the young officer who'd somehow grown into someone stronger and wiser than Marcus had been at that age, and felt pride mixed with terror mixed with hope. Wingmen never leave each other behind, Marcus agreed. That's the first rule, the only rule that really matters. They stood together on the balcony as night settled over the Naval Academy. Behind them, the reception continued. Families celebrated. New officers planned futures that stretched bright and uncertain into classified skis. But on the balcony, a father and son stood together at the beginning of something that would be difficult and painful and necessary. They stood together at the edge of darkness, preparing to fly into it side by side, learning how to navigate ghosts and come home whole. Admiral Patricia Voss watched them from inside, her reflection ghosting in the glass. She thought about the rescue that had saved her wingman 20 years ago, about the pilot who'd flown through hell to bring her home, about debts that could never fully be repaid but could be honored by making sure the next generation learned from the hard lessons. She raised her glass in silent salute to the broken pilot and his son, to the long road of healing ahead, and to the truth that sometimes the bravest thing a warrior could do wasn't flying into combat but learning how to live with what came after. The night deepened. The reception ended. Families dispersed toward hotels and homes and futures, but Marcus Corrigan didn't return to the shelter that night. He went with his son to temporary housing, to a space that was small and spare but warm. They talked until dawn, sharing stories that had been silent for 14 years. James learned about missions that officially never happened. Marcus learned about a childhood that had continued without him. Neither pretended the lost years weren't lost. But they began the work of building something new from what remained. In the months that followed, Marcus would start therapy at the VA, would begin addressing the PTSD he'd tried to outrun, would learn to live with the ghosts instead of being haunted by them. It wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks and hard days and moments when the darkness seemed overwhelming, but he wouldn't face it alone. His son would be there. His Admiral would be there. Even his ex-wife and her husband would be there, creating a strange extended family bound by shared commitment to healing. James would enter flight training, would learn to fly helicopters with the same natural skill his father had shown decades before, would excel at combat search and rescue scenarios, and crucially, he would learn to do it while staying connected to the people who loved him, would learn to share the burden instead of carrying it alone, would learn that being strong meant being honest about weakness, and that the best pilots weren't the ones who never broke but the ones who learned how to heal. Admiral Voss would watch over both of them, mentor and guardian, making sure the next generation didn't repeat the mistakes of the last. She would use her rank to open doors, would share stories about the old days when Marcus was revenant, and the missions were impossible and success meant everyone coming home alive, would make sure that James understood exactly what he was inheriting, both the honor and the cost. The tattoo that had frozen an admiral in her tracks became the symbol of their unlikely family. Marcus would eventually explain its meaning, a stylized phoenix rising from flames, surrounded by call signs of operators he'd saved. Each name was inked in precise script, permanent record of missions that officially never existed. James would get his own version after his first successful rescue, adding his father's call sign to his own arm, creating a legacy that spanned generations. Years later, when James became an instructor at the Navy's Search and Rescue School, he would tell his students about a pilot called Revenant, about missions flown into darkness with no backup and no margin for error, about the cost of being the kind of aviator who refused to leave people behind, about broken fathers and patient sons and admirals who remembered debts, about the truth that the hardest battles weren't always fought in the sky, but in the quiet spaces after, when warriors tried to become human again. And sometimes, when the training was done and the students had gone home, James would call his father. They would talk about flying and ghosts and the weight of service. Marcus would still be fighting his demons, still be working through trauma that might never fully heal, but he would be fighting with support instead of isolation, with family instead of alone, with hope instead of just survival. The homeless veteran who'd come to watch his son graduate, who'd been recognized by a tattoo and resurrected by truth, never became wealthy or famous, never got his name on buildings or his story in official histories, but he got something more important. He got his son back, got a second chance at being a father, got to teach the next generation how to fly into darkness without getting lost in it, got to learn, slowly and painfully but genuinely, how to live with the ghosts without being destroyed by them. And on clear days, when the sky was wide and blue and full of possibility, Marcus Corrigan would stand outside and watch helicopters fly overhead. He would remember what it felt like to dance with physics and probability and death, would remember the faces he'd saved and the faces he couldn't, would remember being called Revenant because he kept coming back from missions that should have killed him. And he would think about his son, flying those same routes, carrying that same weight, but doing it differently. Doing it better. Doing it with the knowledge that broken didn't mean finished, and that the bravest thing a pilot could do wasn't refusing to fall but learning how to get back up. The story of Marcus and James Corrigan wouldn't end with perfect resolution. Real stories rarely did. There would be hard days ahead, relapses and arguments and moments of doubt, but there would also be progress, healing that happened in small increments, connection that deepened through shared experience, understanding that grew from honest conversation about difficult truths. Admiral Voss would retire eventually, leaving behind a legacy of leadership and combat excellence. At her retirement ceremony, she would tell the story of a pilot who'd saved her wingman, who'd refused to leave someone behind even when it was dangerous and difficult and officially discouraged, who'd paid for that choice with pieces of himself that never fully recovered. And she would remind every pilot in attendance that service meant sacrifice, but sacrifice didn't have to mean destruction. That the strongest warriors weren't the ones who never broke, but the ones who learned to heal together. The gymnasium where it all began would host hundreds more graduation ceremonies. Thousands of new officers would take their commissions, make their oaths, step into service without understanding what it would cost. But a few of them, the ones who sought out the stories behind the official histories, would hear about Revenant, about the homeless veteran and the admiral and the son who chose healing over abandonment, about the tattoo that revealed truth and the family that reformed around that truth, about the long, difficult work of coming home from war. And in flight schools across the Navy, instructors would teach students about wingmen, about never leaving each other behind, about the technical skills of combat aviation and the human skills of staying connected, about the truth that the most dangerous enemy wasn't always the one shooting at you, but the one waiting inside, in the darkness after the mission, in the silence between heartbeats, in the long years of trying to live with what you'd done and seen and become. Marcus Corrigan's story would become legend, but not the kind that got carved into monuments or taught in official curricula. It would be the kind passed between pilots in ready rooms, between veterans in therapy groups, between fathers and sons trying to bridge gaps carved by service and sacrifice. It would be the story of how one man flew into hell and came back broken, and how years later, a son and an admiral helped him learn to be whole again. The sky remained, vast and blue and indifferent. It didn't care about human stories or family reconciliations. It didn't care about tattoos or debts or second chances. It simply was, offering space for those brave or foolish enough to enter it. But the men and women who flew into that sky, who danced with death and physics and probability, they cared. They remembered. They told stories about pilots who came before, about missions that officially never happened, about the cost of being the kind of person who refused to leave others behind. And on clear nights when the stars were visible and the air was calm, Marcus Corrigan would stand outside his son's home and look up. He would remember being young and invincible, remember believing he could save everyone, remember the moment that belief died and what rose in its place. He would think about all the years lost to running, to hiding, to believing he was too broken to be loved. And he would feel grateful, in a complicated way that held both joy and sorrow, that he'd been given one more chance. One more mission. One more opportunity to prove that broken could become whole, and that the hardest rescues were sometimes the ones we performed on ourselves.